Thank
you, Mr. Chair. I was actually still willing to listen to Dr. Norman continue his speech, so I hope that you do take another call. It wasn't my intention to thieve it from you. I do want to acknowledge in beginning my address that a lot of cooperation generally sits around trade matters within this House, and I think it's worth noting for the wider public, who all politicians in this House will consistently hear when we're out and about, why don't you agree more often on various issues? Well, trade negotiations are an area where you do tend to see a certain level of cooperation for the benefit of New Zealand ultimately, and I do just want to acknowledge that first up. I do also, though, want to point out that still, even though this is an area where we probably have some broad agreement cross-party here, that John Hayes has still managed to find several areas in which he'd like to chip in interjections, and I'm sure I won't be safe from that either during my address. I want to just acknowledge also that unlike, I believe, one of the last trade agreements where we had quite a significant amount of debate and discussion, both within this place but also within the media, was around negotiations with New Zealand's agreement with China. And there are obviously significant differences between what we're looking at here. And in particular, Hong Kong already has very liberal trading laws which offer duty-free imports for all countries, but still the CEP that we're discussing here today still does offer additional benefits for New Zealand. I do, though, wish to highlight a little later on those areas that were identified as being of some risk to us and acknowledge those areas. I think it's also important to note that Hong Kong is our 9th largest export destination, at least it was in 2009. I think we frequently tend to hone in on particularly large Asian export destinations for New Zealand, but I think it's important to acknowledge where there are particular industries who benefit from our arrangements with places like Hong Kong, despite it being much smaller in comparison to the Chinese market. And I guess also to point out the significant amount of time that goes into these negotiations. Now, whilst we in the House might be presented with a relatively small bill at the end of the work, this particular agreement held its roots as far back, I believe, as Jim Sutton originally. So that alone points out the amount of work, and there, John Hayes, it didn't take long. There, I think, points out the amount of work that goes into these agreements. And, of course, Phil Goff, who has his stamp on a number of these agreements when he was Trade Minister, put a lot of work into this agreement, and I just want to recognise that at this point. But with this particular closer economic partnership, although we've already acknowledged the benefits, I think it is important to notice sometimes the challenges that they can pose for our own internal markets. Now, this one is different in that it's been acknowledged up front that Hong Kong as a market is more heavily focused on services rather than the cheap manufacturing of goods, which have in the past been the areas where we've seen our local manufacturers undercut. And I think very early on in the piece, New Zealand acknowledged that in order to survive in an increasingly globalised world, we were going to have to accept that was going to happen, try and cushion that as much as possible, but also identify those niche markets where we could continue to carve out a space for New Zealand as an economy that has value add, but also can focus in on those areas where we have real strength. And R&D, I believe, is emerging as one of those areas for this country. I would touch on dairy, but perhaps I'll wait for Dr. Norman to continue his contribution on that area instead. But New Zealand manufacturers, we must acknowledge, of footwear and textiles are probably the ones that are going to be facing the greatest risk from the CEP. Some of those we've already seen, however, fall on hard times during the recession. Some of our local members of Parliament in particular would have seen the pressures that those companies were facing that historically has been accumulating through various other trade agreements. And I don't think we could say, Mr Chair, I don't think that we could say that any one of those particular agreements triggered those, but they have had they do have cumulative effect, I think, on some of our manufacturers. Oh, and very soon I'll give you a nod when I'm handing over the baton back to the Greens. There was one final point I just wanted to draw slightly further on the point that was made by my colleague Marianne Street around the particular aspect of this CEP which has an environment agreement with shared objectives between New Zealand and Hong Kong which are aimed at improving the environment and enhancing the capacity and capability of each country's governments, agencies, research organisations, academic institutions and businesses to address trade and environment matters. Now, I'd like to hear a little more discussion within the House of what in a practical terms that will mean for New Zealand. But as a starting point, I think it's incredibly important to acknowledge that these are the places where we need to negotiate and entrench in these agreements those areas that are of most value and worth to us, not just in economic terms, but in terms of our own country's ideology. Environmental issues is one of those, but also labour laws, labour practices, our values in that area must also be entrenched in these agreements, which was why I'm particularly pleased that the CEP does contain a labour memorandum of understanding, which states that while labour laws should not be used for protectionist measures, obviously there are a number of reasons why that cannot be the case, they should also not be weakened or reduced in order to increase trade and investments, obviously undercutting or loosening of labour laws, a race to the bottom as it were. It also provides a framework for New Zealand to raise concerns around labour issues with Hong Kong. Now, why I'm particularly pleased to see this is, whilst spending a bit of time doing work with an international NGO in a voluntary capacity over the years, I saw numerous cases of very loose arrangements where corporates in the US in particular, who for instance had significant contracts with companies operating, for instance, in the Philippines, did state within their own internal organisation that they undertook that their expectation was that labour laws be upheld within the company that they were contracting in, and the labour laws of that country were upheld. But frequently we saw that that was not the case. And yet who has the greatest lever to ensure that even if the Philippines' labour laws are upheld, then the company that is holding that contract in their hands, the one that has the power to say if labour laws, minimum wage terms and conditions for these workers are not upheld, we will not continue to maintain our contract with you. Well, obviously it's the company. If it's not the company, it must be the country that maintains that level of responsibility. Now, I'm loath to load too much weight onto the notion of corporate responsibility, because I think there's a fine line between corporate responsibility and state neglect. So I think it's important that we have equal measures of both, and I think this CEP proves that it is possible to insert a country's as a whole values around labour laws into one of these agreements. So on that note, I'm pleased to make a contribution to this debate, but I look forward to hearing the remainder of the contribution by my colleague, Dr. Norman.